Germany did not begin this story in rubble. It began in certainty, the kind that leaves no room for doubt. Before the bombs, before the hunger, before surrender tasted like betrayal, there was a promise. A grand one. The Reich told its women they were the guardians of the future. The pride of the nation, they said. The moral shield of the people. Every radio broadcast repeated it until it stopped feeling like words and started feeling like truth. As long as our women stand fearless, Germany cannot fall. That line played so often that girls could recite it like a prayer. But the farther reality drifted from that dream, the more desperate the illusion became. Hilda Schneider was 17 the first time she believed she was safe because she was German. She stood in a school assembly hall painted with banners and eagles, watching boys march toward glory while girls were promised honor through loyalty. There was applause, choreographed smiles, music too loud to hear doubt. She would later remember the lighting, gold and warm, like a stage show. They already knew we were at war, she would say years later. But they needed us to feel like we were winning. By 1943, the music had faded, and the glow was gone. The war had stopped happening out there, and had started leaking into kitchens, ration books, and bone-deep cold. Germany still told its women they were strong. But strong women shouldn't shiver through the night because there was no coal left to burn. Strong mothers shouldn't water down soup so thin it was broth in name only. And yet the posters still showed smiling faces. Why? Because hunger is easier to tolerate when you believe it is temporary victory, not permanent neglect. The Reich didn't just command obedience. Curated perspective. Every Allied soldier was described as a brute, a savage, a threat to German womanhood. The papers warned. Capture means humiliation. You will be safer dying than surrendering. And so fear became a leash, one that didn't rattle like chains. It sang like patriotism. Hilda barely questioned it. She didn't need battlefield propaganda. She lived in the slow suffocation of it. If you starve a citizen long enough, gratitude becomes a weapon. They will believe anything if it lets them feel righteous instead of powerless. Yet outside, the sky kept changing colors, from gray to ash to smoke. Her street in Berlin lost its first home to bombs in early '44. An entire family vanished under the rubble. 2 days later, the propaganda office delivered more leaflets about German endurance. Nobody called it a funeral. They called it sacrifice. But hunger never makes good co-stars with heroism. People whispered, then doubted, then rationed hope the way they rationed flour, tiny, defensive, afraid to run out. By late 1944, girls were no longer just the pride of the nation. They were labor, nurses, radio spotters, clerks, relief volunteers, uniforms without weapons, stationed between war and collapse. And still, the speeches said Germany stood firm. But if strength was real, why were they cold? Why were cellars packed with more fear than furniture? Why were the lines for bread longer than Sunday prayers? And if America was a monster, why did mothers secretly say they hoped their sons were captured by the British, not the Reich's allies, because at least the British fed their prisoners? Questions sharpen when hunger does. Hilda's breaking point didn't look like fear. It looked like silence. One morning she waited in line for potatoes, only to learn the delivery had been rerouted to the military. The woman beside her, a widow with 2 children, collapsed into quiet tears. Not dramatic, not angry, just empty. Hilda remembered thinking, this is not how a glorious nation treats its loyal people. But out loud she said nothing. No one did. In Germany by late war, silence was the only safe language. That was the moment she began obeying out of inertia, not belief. Which is more dangerous to a regime, an enemy, or a citizen who no longer believes? By winter, the Reich didn't bother with pride anymore. Conscripted desperation. Women like Hilda were mobilized, not as warriors but as witnesses to defeat. Their work was paperwork, transport logs, relief coordination. The dull scaffolding of a dying machine. The front had collapsed. The cities were shadows. Even the radios had begun to sound tired. They told us America wanted to break us, Hilda would later recall. But by then we were already broken. Still, she feared capture more than death. Propaganda had done its job. Monsters, she was told, did not negotiate. They destroyed. So when the first American scouts advanced near her posting in early 1945, her pulse wasn't fear of losing her country. Her country had already lost her. Her fear was personal. What will they do to us? That is the brilliance of psychological war. You don't have to defeat a soldier on the battlefield if you have already defeated their belief. The night before their capture, Hilda slept on a cot in a converted school building. Bomb craters still visible outside the windows. There was no breakfast scheduled the next morning. They had no fuel left for boiling water. The last potatoes had been divided among 60 women, and there still hadn't been enough. We told ourselves the Americans would be worse, she said later, because we needed to believe our suffering meant something. That is the final stage of propaganda, when the lie is not believed, but required. Because if the enemy is not a monster, then your sacrifice was not noble. It was needless. When the morning came, the German officers assigned to prepare the women for capture told them one last warning. If they take you, remember, they will treat you like prey. But propaganda can only stretch so far before the world tears through it. Hunger tears faster than fear, and fate was already marching toward them. Boots, engines, orders, and a truth none of them were ready to see. The enemy wouldn't break them. He would feed them, which is far more dangerous to a lie than any bullet or bomb. Because kindness can dismantle a belief system more efficiently than violence ever could. And the moment Hilda saw the first American convoy roll over the ridge, organized, calm, not the screaming monsters from the posters, something in her didn't shatter. It tilted, as if the world had shifted 3 degrees sideways. Nothing dramatic, just enough to destabilize certainty. A question formed, quiet, unwelcome, irreversible. The moment the Americans crossed the ridge, the world did not explode. No gunfire. No screaming. No chows. Just order. That was the first contradiction, the first hairline fracture in the story they had been taught to fear. Hilda stood among dozens of other German auxiliaries, clutching her coat to her chest while her breath smoked in the cold morning air. The officers who had promised glory were gone. They had slipped away in the night, disappearing before the enemy arrived, leaving the so-called protected womanhood alone to face the monsters. Fear, like cold, travels through bone. They waited for brutality. What came instead was instructions. Clear, calm, human. No sudden movements. Hands visible. You will be processed for safety. No harm will come to you as long as you comply. The voice was English, but the tone was not hatred, it was routine. That unsettled the women more than any threat would have. Monsters roar. Men with structure do not. The Americans advanced slowly, weapons lowered, not pointed at the women, but past them, toward the possibility of hidden soldiers. A medic stepped forward before a commander did. That detail stayed in Hilda's mind like a shard of light. The first man she met in enemy uniform wasn't a monster. He was a doctor. He didn't inspect them for weakness. He checked them for injuries. Where was the humiliation, the cruelty, the fate worse than death she had been warned about? It was nowhere, and that absence became the loudest thing in the field. One by one, the women were lined up, documented, searched for weapons, not for shame but for safety. Their names were taken, their ages, their roles. Nothing invasive. No mockery, no threats. Some cried, not from fear, but from the shock of relief. Hilda didn't cry, but she breathed differently. Not shallow, panicked breaths. Slower, involuntary, as if her body finally realized exhaustion was safe to show. She was not a captive of cruelty. She was a witness to contradiction. Transport trucks arrived, warmer than their barracks had been in months. They were given blankets. Blankets. Clean ones. Not patched. Not lice-ridden. Not thin as paper. A corporal handed Hilda one with a simple phrase. It's cold. Cover up. For words. A small gesture. A wrecking ball to propaganda. Kindness is disorienting when you've been taught to expect predation. For the first time since the war began, She wasn't struggling to stay warm. And that is the moment the collapse began, not of borders or armies but of certainty. On the convoy route, the women whispered in corners of the truck bed. Why are they treating us like this? Where are they taking us? Do you think this is a trick? The silence between their questions was louder than the questions themselves. Nobody said the real thought forming in all of them. If this is how the enemy treats us, how badly had our own army lied? The greatest threat to propaganda is not exposure. It is comparison. Hours passed.
No threats. No assaults. No degradation.
Just structure, procedure, hygiene checks, medical observation. The Reich had always said the Allies were barbaric. But barbarians do not start by disinfecting wounds. When they docked at a processing center before transport overseas, Hilda witnessed something she had never seen in her own country since rationing began. There were full barrels of potatoes. Not half barrels. Not scraps. Full. The women stared like they were seeing treasure. No one dared ask if they would get to eat any. The idea itself felt too impossible. That night, an American lieutenant addressed them. He didn't yell. He didn't posture. He didn't sneer. He just spoke like a man contracted by rules bigger than himself. You are prisoners of war. You will be sent to a secure facility where you will have shelter, food, water, medical care, and humane treatment. You are not targets. You are detainees under protection. Protection. The word struck harder than if he had fired a weapon. The Reich told them the world wanted to violate them. Instead, the enemy promised to protect them, which was worse for loyalty. Being captured by an enemy who hated you, or being treated better by an enemy than by your own country. The next days blurred. Paperwork, transfer protocols, ship passage to the U.S. mainland. The women braced themselves constantly, waiting for the moment the mask would drop, when the kindness would turn to cruelty. It never came. Instead came something else. Routine dignity. Even the guards who barely spoke to them carried themselves with discipline, not predation. The absence of fear was terrifying in a different way. If the enemy wasn't evil, then what had they been fighting for? When the transport finally reached American soil, Hilda expected cages, dirt, chain-link pens, some kind of prison animal enclosure. Instead, rows of barracks, laundry lines, clean pathways, design, order. Not a camp of torment, a camp of management. The women looked around like they had stepped onto a forbidden stage set, a place they hadn't been meant to see. Still no beatings.
No starvation. No humiliation.
The psychological collapse continued silently, not from violence but from contrast. They had not been rescued. They had not been pampered. They had simply been treated like people, and it was already more than they had been given at home in years. But the final break in belief wasn't the journey. It was the breakfast that waited for them on day one. Because the moment Hilda tasted American food, real food, hot food, unrationed food, she would realize something irreversible. The enemy fed them better than their own government ever had. Once that truth crosses the tongue, it cannot be erased. What happens to loyalty when nourishment feels like freedom? She was about to find out. And the Reich's entire illusion was about to crumble, not by gunfire, but by scrambled eggs. The mess hall smelled wrong. Not bad, wrong. Too warm. Too rich. Too alive. It wasn't the smell of survival rations, boiled cabbage, or watery broth. It was the smell of fat, of butter melting into something soft and yellow. That scent alone caused a ripple of tension across the line of German prisoners. Hunger had trained their bodies to respond before their minds could. Most of them hadn't smelled real animal fat in over a year. Propaganda could rewrite thoughts, but it could not rewrite appetite. Hilda stood stiff in line, expecting a trick, something humiliating. A test, a threat disguised as generosity. But when her turn came, the cook behind the counter didn't leer or spit or mock. He just scooped. A generous, steaming ladle of scrambled eggs slid onto her tray with a soft hiss of heat. Then bread. Real bread, soft enough to dent under a thumb. Not the sawdust loaves she rationed at home. Then fruit. Fruit. Fresh fruit. Not a rumor. Not a memory. A real orange, bright as sunrise. For a second, she forgot how to breathe. Across the hall, another woman stared at her tray like it was a hallucination. "Is this for us?" she whispered. "No," another murmured, half laughing from disbelief. "This must be for officers. They'll take it back." But no one took it back. No one shouted. No one punished them for touching the food. No guard slapped a hand away. The only instructions were, "Keep the line moving." When Hilda sat down, she felt herself shaking, not from fear, but from the overwhelming instinct of a starving person restraining urgency. Every rationed winter had trained her to stretch food, to eat slowly or not at all. Now the calories were abundant. Her body didn't know whether to trust them. She lifted a forkful to her lips. Butter, salt, warmth, care. It didn't just feed her stomach, it detonated her worldview. She wasn't crying. There were no tears, but something behind her ribs loosened in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. This wasn't mercy. Mercy implies reluctance. This was normal for them. This was the baseline. That was the deepest shock of all. The enemy had better normal than the homeland had sacrifice. Around her, women were breaking quietly in 100 small ways. A trembling lip, a half-swallowed sob, a prayer muttered not out of faith, but out of stunned gratitude. No propaganda speech in the world could stand up against salt, fat, and warmth. Ideology collapses fastest at the dinner table. Later, when guards walked through the hall, they didn't leer. They didn't taunt. One simply said, "If you need more, get in line again. Again. Food twice." A concept so absurd Hilda nearly laughed. In Berlin, civilians stole potato peels from garbage bins. Here, refills were expected. What country treats its enemies better than its own government treats its citizens? That question doesn't politely knock at a belief system. It drills through it. After breakfast, the women were escorted for orientation. They noticed everything now. The camp wasn't built like a cage. It was built like a village. Gardens, wash stations, sleeping quarters with mattresses, not straw. Libraries, even. To the outside world, it was still a POW camp. To people who had starved under Reich rationing, it looked suspiciously like a functioning society. Hilda didn't know whether to feel relief or betrayal. Because what do you do when the monster treats you like a citizen, and your own government treated you like expendable meat? That night, she lay awake in a real bed, with a real blanket, listening to nothing. No bombs. No air raid sirens. No mothers wailing in darkened stairwells. Just stillness. She turned the day over in her mind like a stone worn smooth. "They lied to us," she whispered to herself. It wasn't anger yet. It was disorientation, the dizziness that comes when the floor you trusted is gone. All her life she had been told that capture would strip her of dignity. Instead, it had returned it. Was she still a prisoner? Or had she just been rescued from the wrong side of the fence? The next morning, eggs again. Not a miracle, a routine. And with routine comes recognition. This wasn't a gesture. It was policy. That was when Hilda understood something quietly devastating. The American soldier did not need to hate her to win. He only needed to show her what competence looks like. Armies win territory with bullets. Nations win minds with breakfast. For years she had been told Germany was superior. Yet here she was tasting proof of the opposite. Not hearing. Not reading. Not debating. Eating proof. How does a belief system survive when the body mutinies against it? Food can be propaganda too, except this propaganda was edible, undeniable, and merciful. A woman at the next table put it into words softly, almost trembling. "If this is defeat, what was victory supposed to feel like?" The room went silent, because there was no good answer. The Reich told its women surrender meant ruin. Yet captivity had given them their first taste of peace. Peace does not announce itself with flags or treaties. Sometimes it arrives on a tray, steaming, silent, and impossible to deny. This breakfast, this one ordinary meal, had already done more psychological damage to Nazism than 1,000 leaflets could. And once a belief cracks, it never reseals quite the same. Because now the women were no longer asking, "What will they do to us?" They were asking, what else have we been lied to about? That is the moment minds change forever. And that is only the beginning, because what started with scrambled eggs would soon turn into something far more dangerous to the Reich. Preference. Not obedience. Not tolerance. Preference. The kind that makes a prisoner hesitate before choosing freedom. And tomorrow, these women would see for themselves whether this treatment was a temporary kindness or an entirely different kind of captivity, one built not from force but from comfort. The first week inside the camp did not feel like imprisonment. Felt like decompression. Outside the wire, the world was collapsing. Inside it, routines functioned. Schedules made sense. Meals arrived on time. Beds were warm. Safety was predictable, not theoretical. The Reich had demanded loyalty through fear. America was earning it through normalcy. Normalcy, the one thing war had erased most thoroughly. The women were still prisoners by law, but psychologically. They were crossing a border their guards didn't even realize existed. Every day peeled away another layer of indoctrination. Medical checks, clean clothing, work detail sign-ups instead of forced labor. Even boredom, a luxury most of them hadn't known since the war began. When you have been surviving for years, boredom feels like luxury. The camp had its own rhythm. Not forced, not militarized, but human, breakfast at sunrise. Assignments by mid-morning. Letters inspected and delivered weekly. Books available in multiple languages. Music in the evenings if morale permitted. The fences didn't feel like containment. They felt like perimeter from chaos. And that was the betrayal the Reich could never have predicted. These women didn't feel trapped. They felt protected. Hilda discovered something else. A truth small but seismic. In Germany, she had always felt watched by her own country. Here, she was simply observed by security. One was oppression. The other was order. The difference is subtle until you live it. Then it becomes a gulf as wide as the Atlantic. The guards were distant, but not hostile. They carried rules, not hatred. Some nodded. Some smiled faintly. Some played cards on break near the fence. They talked about baseball, not conquest. They whistled off-key. They argued about coffee flavors. They behaved like people, not propaganda villains. The Nazi propaganda portrait of the American brute dissolved faster than ration bread in hot soup. The first time Hilda heard two guards joking about baseball, she realized something life-altering. They don't wake up thinking about us. They wake up thinking about their own lives. Monsters obsess over their prey. Countries with confidence don't need to. That was when she understood that fear had been a leash, not for the enemy, but for her. There were cultural shocks that weren't about food. Women were not fragile tokens here. They were not trophies. They were not symbols of purity. They were simply people. That alone was liberating. No officer lectured them about sacrifice. No party official scolded them for fatigue.
No propaganda demandit siatrikel divouschen.
Inside a prison camp, Hilda was freer than she had ever been in her own nation. Then came the moment that truly broke the illusion: work assignments. In Germany, work had been duty. Unpaid, expected, and ideologically framed as national honor. Here it was voluntary and compensated through camp privileges.
No slogans. No speeches.
Just practical exchange. You help us, we treat you better. Fairness instead of fanaticism. Hilda signed up for clerical rotation. Others worked kitchen shifts, sewing rooms, or gardens. After work came something nobody had prepared them for: leisure. They could sit in sunlit corners. They could read. They could rest. Prison shouldn't feel like recovery. And yet, it did. One afternoon, while folding linens, another woman whispered something that sounded like treason and truth at once. I feel safer here than I did at home. Nobody contradicted her. How do you go back to rubble after you have tasted stability? How do you re-enter hunger after you have known warmth? How do you honor a regime that left you starving, when the enemy, the supposed beast, lets you feel human again? The camp library became a turning point, not because of books but because of choice. In Germany, information was filtered. Here, information simply existed. They read banned novels, dictionaries, newspapers from neutral nations. Some even read the American press. Different views, conflicting views, and censored views. Freedom doesn't arrive as a flag. It arrives as access. Bit by bit, these women were not just fed, they were unshackled. Not by force, not by ideology, by exposure to a life functioning without fear. Friendships formed quietly, cautiously, but real. Not romances, not scandal, just human knowing. One guard taught them American idioms. Another showed them how to pronounce coffee with a drawl. Laughter became a normal sound again, not an act of defiance, but an accident of living. They were not spectators of normal life anymore. They were participants in it. But the real turning point came months later, when news arrived that repatriation would begin soon. Return. Home. Germany. But which home? A homeland in ruins? Ration lines and suspicion? A government that lied? A society that consumed loyalty but returned nothing? Or this? Shelter, warmth, food, dignity. The unthinkable question took shape. What if captivity is safer than freedom? When that question appears, indoctrination has already died. Repatriation didn't feel like liberation. Felt like eviction. Women who once trembled at the idea of capture now trembled at the idea of release. When sign-up sheets circulated for early transport back to Germany, not everyone signed. Some hesitated. Some refused. Some begged to stay. This was no longer about hunger. It was about identity. And identity is much harder to repatriate than a body. The camp gates were still locked, but the real prison that had held them was already gone. They didn't need fences to keep them inside. They needed courage to walk back out. Because for the first time since girlhood, they had glimpsed a life not shaped by fear. And now they had to decide whether to return to one. The mind war was over, and America had won it without a single bullet. Freedom did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived quietly, a clipboard, a roster, a list of names scheduled for repatriation. No marching bands. No cheers. Just a sentence spoken without ceremony. You're going home. Home. A word that should have sparked relief. Instead, it landed like a weight. The women exchanged glances. Uncertain, hesitant, subdued. The irony was brutal. The same gates they once feared crossing inward were now the gates they feared crossing outward. Inside this camp, they had shelter. Inside this camp, they had food. Inside this camp, they had safety from their own side. Outside there would be rubble, suspicion, denazification boards, scarcity, ruin, and worst of all, the unspoken guilt of returning to a nation that had lied to them about everything. When the guard said, "You can leave," their bodies didn't move, because psychological captivity doesn't break when a gate opens. It breaks when the captive chooses which side of the gate feels like survival. Some said it plainly. My country abandoned me long before I surrendered. Others said nothing, silence said enough. The first transport convoy was scheduled for the following week. Names were read aloud. Some stepped forward. Others remained still. 2 women quietly stepped out of line. Then 3 more. Then 5. One asked a guard, voice low, almost embarrassed, "Is there any way we can stay?" Stay. Not as refugees. Not as fugitives. Just stay. Because whatever waited in Germany was not home. Home is where safety feels normal. Officials were stunned. Prisoners normally dream of escape. These women dreaded release. Not because they preferred America as a nation, most barely knew it. They preferred stability. Because they had forgotten what it felt like to live without fear. The mind does not cling to flags. It clings to safety. Hilda watched her own name appear on the return list. Her stomach turned. Not because she hated Germany, but because she no longer recognized it. The illusion she grew up with had died months ago. What remained was only geography. What was she returning as? A patriot? A fool? A survivor carrying evidence of a better world? That is the cruel genius of indoctrination. Once you see outside of it, you can never unsee it. The closer the departure day came, the quieter the camp became. Conversations stalled. Laughter faded. not because conditions worsened, but because loss had once again entered their vocabulary. Not the loss of freedom, the loss of dignity which they feared would greet them the moment they stepped back into ruins. Some wrote letters, unsure if they wanted them answered. Some walked the perimeter fence not to measure confinement, but to memorize the feeling of order before re-entering chaos. The guards could sense it too, something strange, almost philosophical hanging in the air. They had not expected gratitude. They certainly had not expected reluctance. America's victory was not military anymore. It was psychological. When a POW camp feels more humane than home, the war of ideology is already over. The morning of departure was cold. Clouds sat low over the horizon, heavy and undecided, mirroring the weight on everyone's shoulders. The buses waited, engines idling, doors open, freedom mechanical, indifferent, humming. Not a single woman rushed. They walked slowly, as if each step was a negotiation with a world collapsing behind them. A guard quietly said to Hilda, "You made it through the war. That's what matters." She looked at him not in argument, but in realization. "I didn't survive there," she said. "I survived here." Not sarcasm, not flattery, truth. When the buses began boarding, two women turned around and walked away instead of forward, silent defection by hesitation. No escape attempt, just refusal of return. No one dragged them back. That shocked them even more than the eggs had. In Germany, refusal was met with force. Here, refusal was considered, discussed, processed. Choice was permitted even for prisoners. Choice is the first oxygen of freedom. In the following months, records show dozens of European POWs, not only women, asked to delay or avoid repatriation. Some were eventually permitted to remain as laborers, translators, camp staff, or sponsored migrants. They were not escaping captivity. They were escaping the return to hopelessness. The guards did not win their loyalty. Their country had lost it. The Reich never understood that control built on fear is always temporary, because the moment a person glimpses dignity, fear stops working. You cannot unteach someone what respect feels like. Before boarding, Hilda looked once more at the camp. The fences, the barracks, the gardens, the silhouettes of guards walking perimeter under a gray sky, and understood something devastating. This place was supposed to break her. Instead, it rebuilt her. The war had not stripped her humanity. Her side had. The enemy had given it back. When she finally stepped onto the bus, it was not out of obedience, but because she now knew what her choice meant. Going home was not return. It was testimony. She had seen another world, and that made her dangerous. Not to America, but to the lie she grew up inside. Some prisoners leave prison. Some outgrow it. People assume liberation is always movement toward freedom. But sometimes, freedom is what you're forced to leave behind. And for women like Hilda, the deepest wound of the war was not defeat. It was learning that the enemy had treated them like citizens long before their own country ever did. Some wars end when the guns fall silent. Others end when truth is tasted for the first time. If you want more stories where history turns upside down, where the unexpected becomes undeniable, stay with this channel. The Untold is only beginning.